Hello everyone, I'm here making yet another non-Let's Play video because I just finished Dragon Age 2 and have a few thoughts on the game. And since I'm currently doing a Let's Play of Dragon Age Origins, I feel somewhat obligated to share those thoughts. There's some good, there's some bad, and I'm likely to get yelled at by both the fans and the haters for all this. But before I gripe at or praise the various parts of the game, I need to qualify that I think BioWare has made some very poor decisions as a business as of late. Employees writing reviews for their own game, making downloadable content that's available to be purchased on launch day, and their public relations department only making things worse with poor attitude. Just for example. But I pin quite a bit of that blame to Electronic Arts, and I believe I'm able to judge a game based on its own merit, and not the merit of the management staffs of the developers, so make of that what you will. I'm also forming these opinions after one full playthrough that took just under 40 hours, so I, by no means, know everything there is to know about the game. For those of you that are still avoiding spoilers, but want my opinion of the game for whatever reason, here's the Cliff's Notes version. The graphics are decent but not amazing. I didn't notice any glaring problems in the animations, especially during combat. And in general, said combat flows well and can be appropriately frantic for my tastes, unless it comes to boss battles, where it felt like an exercise in tedium and or attrition more often than not. The story works well for the first 2.5 acts, but comes unraveled in the ending and doesn't come to a resolution. The characters are memorable enough, and the banter flows much more freely, with mostly excellent voice acting. The level-up system has been streamlined well, although I wanted different choices for my warrior hawk specialization trees. Kirkwall proper is a very large area to explore, with a handful of non-Kirkwall areas for some minor variety, but to deal with the crafting system, every area has to be searched thoroughly either 3 or 6 times, so that's both a positive and a negative. The music is up to BioWare's usual standards, but really doesn't try to impress. The vast majority of the side quests feel like they're designed to just pad out gameplay, or give experience and money without adding any real content. Finally, there are a few bugs that can really throw a wrench into your plans. Final score, 7 out of 10. Now, with that out of the way, from here on, spoilers are going to happen, so you've been warned. I should probably start off with the examples of the bugs. The first example is during the fight with the High Dragon. During the fight, the dragon periodically hops up to a high unreachable perch and summons a wave of mostly fodder enemies, and then when those are dead, it hops back down and resumes fighting the group directly. When I fought this dragon, after the second wave of summons, instead of hopping down, it stayed up on the perch, where Anders and Varric could fire away with no fear of retaliation until its health fell low enough for the next summon wave. Then the dragon finally went back to its proper pattern. The other really glaring bug I'm going to bring up is that after I helped Anders finish the Justice quest to visit the Chantry, the whole bit where Hawk distracted the Grand Cleric, shortly thereafter, Anders changed clothes into more of a black suit and then became unselectable as a playable character, but remained in a darkened state on the character select screen, similar to the way Bethany or Carver do if they're still alive in Act 2, and this continued until he showed up in the endgame. Now with the bugs out of the way, let's go into a little bit more detail on the different areas. First, we have combat. The overall feel of combat was spectacular. Rogues got to bounce around like Errol Flynn, mages finally figured out how to hit people with their staves, and warriors, they still stood in the middle of all the chaos and turned many things into a fine red mist. As tedious as it felt at times, it was still never completely unsatisfying to see Hawk and company plow through horde after horde of assailants and come out on the other end of it with ease. Hawk usually feels like a genuine badass, and the rest of the companions are more than capable fighters on their own, with usually more than competent AI backing them up. Combat though suffers with the way that the battle often feels more like an exercise in tedium or attrition than a challenge. For starters, the boss battles in this game as a whole aren't particularly difficult and don't require a great deal of planning. This may be a problem in its own right, but it's not the main one that drags this area down. The main problem is that most boss fights that I ran into, especially once Act 2 gets about halfway finished, was that they became little more than marathons against huge sacks of hit points that do little more than a few basic attacks, with wave after wave of fodder enemies spawning in to periodically try to dress things up. Sometimes the boss may go into an unreachable position to let the minions chew on the party while the minions get slaughtered, sometimes not. While this worked pretty well as the boss fight for the very end of Dragon Age Origins, using this tactic repeatedly for bosses in the game makes those boss battles less of a challenge and more of an endurance test. This problem also extends to normal combat somewhat when such a large amount of encounters involve multiple waves of mostly harmless enemies, with maybe one or two enemies of note showing up. And if there were more than one threat, they were rarely together. All this only feels like an accomplishment the first couple of times it happens. And afterward, again here's the word, it just feels tedious, and feels less like strategy than it really needs to for a game that advertised the strategic elements of combat. If they just had maybe, one big wave of enemies with a couple of real threats involved a lot more often, it would have been a much better idea for the majority of these encounters, and more of the bosses should have been similar to the Rock Wraith that you find in the Deep Roads Expedition or the Arishok battle at the end of Act 2. That would have been a lot more enjoyable in my opinion. Next, we have the game world. Kirkwall itself felt like a large, somewhat run-down city should, with a ton of NPCs walking around having conversations. The different areas all had their own personalities without needing to completely change the scenery, and it felt like most areas in Kirkwall were actually larger than most of the outdoor areas in Dragon Age Origins. It actually felt and looked like a real, albeit exaggerated city, and it was nice to see how it and its inhabitants changed throughout the years. While the city wasn't spectacular to look at, there was a decently sized forest environment and multiple cave environments available for the occasional change of scenery, but I was surprised at how varied the various zones of the city actually were. However, while having a huge sprawling city and several other large maps to explore is generally a good thing, it's a mixed blessing here. First, largely due to the time constraints in development, every area in the game seems to be recycled at least 3 times. Now, area recycling isn't a terrible idea when done in moderation, but in this game, it's the rule instead of the exception. For an example, I have to bring up the crafting system, and in particular, the resource gathering needed to use the crafting system. To find all the different resource nodes that will allow the crafters to have a full set of potions, grenades, etc. available to buy, you have to carefully explore every area in the game, and this is fine and works pretty well mostly. But every area of the city has to be searched thoroughly 6 separate times to find everything, once by day and once by night in each of the 3 different acts. Now, it's fine to reward searching, and it's really nice to have large areas to snoop around in. But by that first pass on Act 2, I was really ready to hope I had just already found enough resources that whatever I ran across undertaking the various missions would be what I needed for the rest of the game to get the different items I needed. This area recycling continues into the random encounters in various dark alleys and underground passages that get used. By the middle of Act 2, the game had completely run out of new maps to throw me in, and started repeating the same maps I'd already seen, only slightly altered by having different passages open and closed with each repetition. The best example of this that I can think of is the gang hideouts. During the course of the game, exploring the city at night, you run across different gangs, you kill a large number of their members, and a gang hideout opens up. This happens for just about every one of the major areas in Kirkwall, but strangely enough, when you go visit these gang hideouts, just about every single one uses the exact same map. And it really did feel, here's that word again, tedious, having to clear out the same area 3 or 4 times, only with just a previously open branch of the main path closed, and where it forced me to take a different path to get through. Again, I understand that the lack of different maps was largely due to time constraints, but that doesn't mean that the game doesn't suffer from it. Now let's move on to the quests. Generally, the story quests filled the role of moving the plot along, but didn't really bring a whole lot new to the table. The companion quests were generally above average and worked well as means to delve into the companion personalities, although I was induced to groan more than a few times when the game started to feel like a bad romantic comedy. Overall, I thought the quests were fine and made sense, but there were far too many of these little delivery quests that involved finding an item in a pile of rubble, barrel, crate, etc., and then taking it to the person it belonged to. For example, while on an expedition to the Deep Roads to save some dwarves that decided to try their luck at searching the area Hawk's expedition already covered, you find a lyrium-laced bilge hoop sitting next to some smashed chests. This needed to be returned to a person in Darktown. Once delivered, this person and the item were never brought up again. I was kind of left wondering, well, how did it get down there in the first place? It would have been nice to have a little follow-up, but that's the problem. These quests never get followed up on. And while a few of them are fine and can make sense, especially if it's used like I just, thought, where you get a little bit more backstory into how that piece got there in the first place, those would be fine, but there are so many of these in Dragon Age 2, they lead nowhere and really felt like just basic experience and time padding. Fewer delivery quests, and having those few quests actually tie into the backstory would have been a lot more satisfying. And then we have the companions. The various characters that decide to travel with Hawk and fight alongside him are a pretty varied bunch, with some stark contrasts in personality, and there was some vast improvement from Origins in how those characters interacted with each other, and not just with Hawk. Having the game based in a city made a large part of this possible, as it allowed the characters to not just sit around the camp, but instead gave the semblance that they have their own lives that involve more than just running on Hawk's heels as he charges into combat, or waiting around the campfire for him to come get them. For example, Aveline takes up a job as a city guard, Merrill takes up residence over at the Alienage, Anders ends up running a clinic on the bad part of town, and you can find these characters there, tending to their daily routine, anytime they aren't in your party. And occasionally, you will see other characters paying them a visit when you go to visit them, such as Isabella arguing with Anders over his curing her diseases with magic, or Varric trying to bribe Aveline. The voice acting is also on par with BioWare's usual efforts, with a mostly excellent job done, but with a few moments it fell a little bit more flat. Finally, and I'm sure you're glad to hear that word, we reach the story. The story of the Mage and Templar conflict within Kirkwall was small in scope, but was pieced pretty well together. Following the life of Hawk and his companions throughout the course of the game was actually satisfying to me, and seeing how the aspects of the city changed or remained the same as the years rolled by kept me interested enough to keep playing through and wanting to see how everything unfolded, with a few unexpected turns along the way. However, As much as I enjoyed the first 2.5 acts, the ending infuriated me. The way the ending was presented, it's clear that the story in Dragon Age 2 was never intended to have resolution, but instead just serve as a piece to fill the gap between Dragon Age Origins and Dragon Age 3, and also causes all the decisions made and people helped through the course of the game to feel largely irrelevant. There is no right side or wrong side, as the game seems to indicate throughout the story, whether the Templars are actually right to clamp down on the mages, or the mages are really oppressed for no significant reason, when it turns out that both sides are clearly in the wrong and largely unapologetic about it. Oh, did you think that the mages were truly oppressed, and you fought on their side, helping apostates flee the city and setting up Templars? Surprise! Orsino really did condone the use of blood magic and necromancy, and even approved the work of the person that committed serial murders to recreate his bride, with one of those victims even turning out to be Hawke's mother. Or did you side with the Templars, convinced that Meredith was doing the right thing and she just wasn't delusional? Surprise, she was being driven crazy for the last 6 years by the corrupted lyrium that was found in Hawke's expedition. Pick either side and you end up feeling like you've been duped. You can argue over which side drove the other to the more extreme measures first, but in the end, whichever side you pick will just end up betraying you. Well, I can see how this may be good and true to life, and how in real life there are very few black and white, right versus wrong scenarios. We're still talking about a game, and an ending that provides precious little closure, while existing for the primary reason of trying to set up a sequel that honestly has a chance that it'll never be made, is a really bad ending. So there you have my 2 cents on Dragon Age 2. It's a solid game with some very glaring flaws. Take care, folks. See you later.